They told me there was no place for me at our own Christmas table. I remember the words like a bell in a quiet church, clear, unavoidable. My son looked at his wife and then at me, and what he said was not a question or even a command, so much as a final folding of a paper that had once been family. "There's no place for you, Mom." I put my hand on the back of the chair, smiled because anger would have been a mess on the holiday china, and I walked out. I did not run, I did not beg. I left my gift, an apple pie still warm under a linen towel, on the sideboard and stepped into the December night with my pearls tucked inside my coat pocket, not because they were worth anything, but because I liked how they felt, round and steady against my skin. People at the window stared. The wife, Vanessa, stood by the table as if she had just finished arranging a stage. My son's face had gone flat the way a photograph does when someone holds it too near the light. For a heartbeat, I thought of the kids I'd kissed goodnight 1,000 times, of stockings hung, of carols hummed off key. Then the cold took the edges of that thought, and I walked to my car. I drove 3 blocks, stopped by a park bench, and did what my mother taught me when the world tilted. Breathe, count, decide. When you are 68 and you have outlived 2 husbands, you learn to measure your heart more by choice than by impulse. That night, as carolers cleared the street and a neighbor's tree blinked its red and green insistence, I took one hand from the steering wheel and felt for the small organizer under my coat. It was thin, leather, the kind you slip into your bag when you don't want to carry paper that says evidence. Inside were receipts, a folded note, a thumb drive or tuber envelope, small things that looked unimportant on their own, but if you stacked them, made a ladder high enough to climb out of a lie. If you love stories like this, drop your city in the comments and subscribe. There were 3 small things before the doorbell episode. The first was a dinner invitation that never came. We had hosted every Christmas for years. My son and his first family had been regulars. No fuss, just too many candles and my stubborn pudding. When Vanessa arrived, I waited to be asked to bring my pie. Instead, I began to notice the gaps. Invitations to Sunday brunch stopped. Photographs of my granddaughter at school came with comments but not tags to my account. And someone moved my name down on Facebook so my posts were hidden from family albums. Those were mild slights. Annoying, yes, but explainable. The second small thing was money disappearing from places that should not have been empty. A check I'd mailed for the college fund arrived back with a note from a bank I'd never used. A package I'd ordered for a birthday was returned unclaimed, though my son swore no one had refused it. I chalked these up to bureaucracy at first. Then there were the calls Vanessa took, always pulling her aside into the hallway or into the garage. Voices on the other end were clipped. Sometimes she took a call and came back laughing, like someone who had practiced a script. My son, bless him, said, "They're business people, Mom. Let's not pry." He wanted peace. The third small thing was a name, Carlos, that kept coming up in stray sentences. Once I heard it mumbled in the background of a video chat from Vanessa's phone. Once, in a stack of envelopes accidentally left on the counter, I found a letter addressed to someone in Los Angeles with a return address that was an accountant's office. The name felt like a stitch you find and pull at the hem until the whole skirt starts to unravel. I kept my hands off it for a while. You don't accuse your son's wife of deception on a feeling. You collect. I had given my son everything I could. He had been a boy who fell asleep on my lap after a bell choir rehearsal, hands upstretched like he'd been applauded to sleep. When he married Vanessa, I let hope fill the spaces that were not yet full. I made her casseroles. I wrapped birthday gifts in tissue and inset my mother's thank you note inside the card. I bunkered small kindnesses because marriages are brittle in new places, and sometimes you need to glue them together slowly. But kindness is not a blindfold. There are times you have to lift your head and look. After that Christmas dinner, I do not mean to make the evening larger than it was. It was a meal on a long table with a centerpiece of needles and candles, but the way they closed the family around the table left the center cold. They had worked for weeks, the setting, the music, the right shade of napkin. Vanessa had even suggested a hymn in the playlist, like salt on the tongue, familiar, but making the meal feel ordained. My son recited grace with his eyes on his wife, an odd ceremony, intimate in the wrong place. Then the sentence, "There's no place for you, Mom." It landed and did not lift. I walked home slow. The heater in my kitchen hummed awake. I put the pie in the oven because there was nothing else to do with habit, and I unpacked the little organizer. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, where the light made a small circle and held it like a stage. My hands did not tremble. I had been assembling doubt the way a seamstress gathers thread, small tensions turning into definite lines. I have never been a woman to let doubt be merely ornamental. hired a private investigator 3 weeks before. My son thought I had called a caterer. He was right that I wanted a service, but it wasn't for food. I wanted facts. My friend Joan, who knows more about people than she does about recipes, put me in touch with James Morrison, a man with more patience than gossip in his head. We met in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon. He wore a hat that might have belonged to a gardener and spoke in sentences that arranged themselves like careful boxes. He asked me what I wanted. I said the truth. He said he could find it. James's early reports arrived like modest packages, copies of forms, screenshots, bank transaction headers, and I folded each one into the organizer like an offering. At first, there was nothing dramatic: a business registration with a different name, an old email address connected to a phone number that did not show up in public directories, a mailing address tied to a mailbox service. James is not a man given to hyperbole. He wrote notes in the margins: inconsistent, check tax ID, further inquiry. He never wrote proof. Investigators do not write grand things until they can hand them over. Then he found a marriage record, 2 names, a county clerk stamp, a signature block. It was a copy of a document that claimed Vanessa had been married previously to a man in another state. The record had been filed under a name that Vanessa sometimes used and sometimes did not. It suggested the possibility of bigamy in a tone that made my chest tighten. James subpoenaed a certificate, and what he received back had a seal that did not match the county's. He explained to me, in slow sentences, that some documents could be forged by someone who knows where to look, but not necessarily who they are. He pointed to a handwriting sample that did not match. "We can trace the bank," he said. "We can ask for records." I nodded. I remember thinking then that the world felt like a ledger, transactions and signatures that spelled out a life, and someone had been spending other people's names. The more James looked, the more the small things piled into a pattern. There were bank transfers from accounts in our name that went to a handful of shell accounts, invoices paid to businesses that did not exist, and a birth certificate with a number that did not check out with the hospital registrar. The paperwork suggested not just false identity, but active deception. At the center of it, the most painful discovery, was a child, the baby Jacob, whom Vanessa had said was my grandson. On paper, Jacob had a birth certificate, a pediatrician's note, a social security number. In person, he hugged my leg like he'd always known me, slept on my shoulder like he belonged. The documents, James wrote, did not align with public records from California, where a man named Carlos Santos had filed a missing person inquiry months earlier. His inquiry matched the date Vanessa claimed Jacob had been born. There is a particular cold that comes when the body of a thing doesn't match its shadow. A child held on your lap who belongs in another life is that cold. I will not and cannot repeat the gory details of what followed in the files James brought me. I will say this plainly. Something beyond mere deception had happened. James's words were measured. Potential kidnap, false identity, money trails. He referred me to a legal contact who specialized in elder fraud, and to a woman, a social worker, who advised me on next steps with respect to the child. I followed those recommendations, because the one thing that guided me, even in rage, was law. That night, sitting at my kitchen table with an apple pie that had cooled but not hardened, I looked at a photograph of Jacob, chubby-cheeked, sucking on his fist, and I realized the stakes sat heavy like a stone in the pond. The image of him on my lap had been a cushion that someone had manufactured. It was not the child's fault. Children are not conspirators. They are victims. The next morning, I told my son I needed to come over to help with the leftover ham. He laughed on the phone in that way that men do to deflect unease. "You're making a big deal of little things, Mom," he said. He meant it kindly enough. He wanted to believe his wife. He wanted the story he had been living to be true. That is love, too, the refusal to see the thing that might unmake you. I waited. When I told him, calmly, because I knew which battles require a steady voice, that I had hired someone, the change in him was subtle but solid. It was like the difference between a warm room and a locked door. His eyes got the shape of denial. We have always loved in layers. Sometimes the top layer is quick to resist what comes beneath. I remember the evening James came by with a manila folder that had no name on the cover. He sat at my kitchen table and emptied it like a baker lays out his ingredients: photographs, scans, bank statements with numbers redacted, a copy of a marriage license in a county I had never visited. He did not sensationalize. He did not raise his voice. He pointed to the lines and said, "Look here." The forged documents were not brilliant crafts, but deliberate work. Someone had made a profession of making someone else's life look tidy. There were signatures that were off by a millimeter, a hospital code that did not correspond to the facility claimed, and a pediatrician whose name appeared on the certificate but not in any local physician's directory. James explained how he had used legal processes to request records, subpoenas, formal queries, calls to registrars. He told me that law enforcement would want hard evidence, emails, IP addresses, bank routing numbers. He said they could get it with due process. Among the pages was a transfer ledger, small sums siphoned incrementally from accounts that were not hers and routed through layers until they landed in a handful of accounts connected to a network of shell corporations. The pattern looked like a slow bleed, 1,000 pinpricks rather than one visible wound. James said fraudsters are patient. They test, they calibrate. That's how they avoid detection. His tone did not try to frighten me. It was simply practical. Then there was a note, folded, with a phone number and the name Carlos.
James had redacted the number on the printout, but he told me in a way that was fact and not confession that Carlos had been trying to find his son for months and had taken the matter to a missing persons unit in California. The log entries showed call dates that predated our son's knowledge by weeks. Someone created a story, James said. Someone made a child into a ledger line and a ledger line into a family. That phrase, child into a ledger line, hurt worse than I expected. This was not a soap opera or a scandal for gossip's sake. A child had been moved and labeled in ways that hurt at the stomach. I thought of the many small rituals of my life, wrapping gifts, patting heads, tucking blankets, and how they had been folded into a fiction. After James left, I did what people with some training in patience do. I sat on my couch and arranged the papers like the face of a clock. The minutes ticked. I called a lawyer on his recommendation, who spoke in calm, plain terms about jurisdiction and federal interest. The lawyer said coldly that when an affair crosses state lines and money moves through banks, federal agencies tend to pay attention. He used the phrase multi-jurisdictional fraud. I tasted the word, and it had no flavor but urgency. It would have been easy if I were someone else, to storm back to their house that night, to wave the file and demand answers. That is not my way. I believe in law because I have seen the alternative, chaos masquerading as quick justice, and it frightens me more than institutional slowness. I also believe that dignity is not a show you wear for the witness box. It is the muscle you use when the cameras leave. So I planned. There are things about a person that outsiders do not see. The way they buy toothbrushes in bulk for a household they love. The way they remember the exact brand of cereal someone likes. It is the accumulation of such small attentions that makes a life together. It is also sometimes the reason you are underestimated. They assume you are easy to soothe. They assume you will step back. I decided I would use that underestimation. I am an old woman, not an angry one. I have learned to let my anger be an engine, not a spectacle. 2 weeks after the Christmas table, I was back at their house for what people will call an ordinary family lunch. My son greeted me at the door with a tight smile. Vanessa moved with a practiced courtesy, as if kindness were a choreography she had been taught. Jacob, my Jacob, the child I had held for months, reached for my hand. I saw then how deeply human the problem was, an infant who trusted my lap. I kissed the top of his head and felt in the hollow between my ribs the mixture of resolve and fear that would not let me sleep. That night on my way home, a police car pulled up behind me. I do not scare easily, but the sight of red and blue made me carry my organizer like a talisman. When I got in, I found an envelope slid under my door. It was a photocopy of a receipt for a hotel in a small town 2 states away. Nights paid with a card I did not recognize. On the back was a number that was 1 digit off from the customer service line for a shipping company. Someone wanted me to be afraid. Someone wanted me to know they had reached. They were not yet violent. Not yet. Threats are a language in themselves. Coded notes, the feeling of being watched, the wrong car at the next stoplight. I called James. He told me to be cautious, no heroics. He told me to lock the doors, to keep the organizer close, to avoid predictable routes. He said he would keep digging. He did not offer me false comfort. He spoke of bureaucracy as a kind of armor that has its own weight, but will, if used properly, stand between you and danger. After that, the calls began. I spoke with Detective Linda Hayes at the county line. She had been the officer assigned to a missing persons report that matched the date on our documents. Her voice was steady. She asked me for what I had. I told her the truth in a plain way. The documents, James's notes, my suspicion. She thanked me and made no promises. That is how police are meant to behave. They will not tell you that everything will be fine. They will tell you what step they can take next. She said she would open an inquiry.
and suggested that because of the interstate nature, there might be federal interest. I was relieved that someone else had the authority to demand records and subpoenas that I could not. I called the number labeled Carlos twice that week. The line went to voicemail, and each time I left a message that felt inadequate, too short, too brittle. Once a voicemail returned. A man with a low, tired voice said he was sorry, but he had no idea how to make sense of the papers he had found. The recordings of his calls to local agencies referenced a boy he had not seen since birth. They told me they could help, he said on the recording, but no one called back. I cried then, softly, for good reason. The ache in someone else's voice is not a story. It is a wound. The night after I found the receipt under my door, Vanessa's car vanished from the driveway. My son called me in a panic. He was skittish, the way people are when their world slips in obvious ways. She says she had to take Jacob to her sister in another town, he said. His voice was a reed and wind. She said it was urgent. The truth was, I did not know whether to be more furious or more frightened. I have always believed that people who hurt others do not stop at one hurt. Predatory systems, fraud rings, identity markets, people who manufacture lives, have a way of scaling like greed. You stop one, they move to another. That thought lodged against my ribs like a stone. I did not sleep that night. I collected the files and drove to a church we had attended in my youth, because churches have long benches good for thinking, and because the lights there stay on late. I sat and sorted the papers, lining them by category: money, identity, contact. I made lists. I called the lawyer again. He reminded me that federal agencies moved slower, but with deeper legal teeth, and that if the data suggested systematic fraud and a child removed across state lines, the FBI might become involved. The name Agent Patricia Moreau had been mentioned. I had never met her. The idea of a federal agent felt like a relief and then a new tension. If your life is now an investigation, so too are the people you love. On the third week after the dinner, James called me and said, "We have a name connected to the transfers. It's not just a person, it's an account linked to others." He spoke like a man tracing a web with a stick. He told me about a figure in one chain of transfers that looked like a coordinator, the sort of person who builds schemes and recruits others. His words were cautious, architect in tone, not accusation. He asked if I was willing to pass everything to the authorities. I understood why he asked. The law needs witnesses who will not be cowed. I thought of my son, asleep in his small house without knowing the scaffolding his life rested on. I thought of Jacob, a face that felt like a prayer and like a ledger entry all at once. I thought of Carlos, whose voice on a message sounded like someone who had been hustled out of time. The choice was not between my son's happiness and my need for truth. It was between protecting a lie and protecting a child. Sometimes protection is the hard path. Sometimes you must be the person who breaks a thing in order to save it. So I called James and asked him to send me everything in digital form. He did. I sat at my kitchen table with the files open, and the house held its breath. In one corner of my mind, my mother's voice said, "Be kind but not blind." In another, my father's old laugh scolded me for getting tangled in other people's affairs. We are all heirs to small contradictions. The phone buzzed then, a text from an unknown number. It read simply, "We see you." It was a threat, thin as paper. I felt the old calm drain and something colder pressure in its place. I thought of the receipts, the shells, the transfers. I thought of the way a network can coordinate to erase a person's presence, to move a child, to buy loyalty. At midnight, I sat with the organizer, the thumb drive in its paper envelope, and I dialed a number I had not expected to call. I had planned for this moment in the sense that I had prepared the files, lined up the lawyer, and let Detective Hayes know to expect me to come forward with something more concrete. But preparation and courage are not the same. Courage is the decision to do, regardless of the fear. My finger hovered over the first number. I had 2 calls to make. One would be to a man whose voice I had only heard on a recording. The other would be to a department that had the power to demand what these people had hidden. For a long moment, I sat in the cooling air of my kitchen, with the taste of pie gone and the pearls cold inside my pocket. The world around me hummed low, the refrigerator, the radiator, the far-off clock. I steadied myself, the way a swimmer braces before the dive. Then I lifted my hand and began to dial. I stopped there. The first digit left my mouth like a lighthouse beam. The rest of the numbers waited, each a small step into a life I had not known I would claim. I thought of my son at his table, of his voice folding into Vanessa's, and of the way dignity is sometimes the loudest thing you have when everyone else is shouting. I thought of the child asleep in another person's name, and of Carlos, a stranger turned necessary ally. I pressed the next button and felt a door click somewhere, a hinge releasing. The phone continued to ring. The phone kept ringing until it stopped, like someone finally deciding to listen. A voice picked up, low, tired, and then there was a pause, as if the man on the other end was measuring whether this was another wrong number. "Carlos," I said, and my voice sounded like a thing I'd been practicing quietly for weeks. For a second, he didn't say anything. Then he spoke, haltingly, like a man who had been trying to find the edges of a nightmare. He heard my name, then James's name, then the word Jacob. The pause that followed was a kind of surrender. "Where is he?" Carlos asked. It was not an accusation. It was a map, the single question that pulls plot and person into one point. I told him what I could without putting anyone at risk. Dates, receipts, the way the birth record didn't match a hospital's ledger. The hotel receipt slipped under my door. I told him about the way the child had slept on my shoulder and seemed to know my hands, and how that made my gut twist, because love does not erase facts. When I finished, he said, "I thought it was a scam. They told me I was being silly. The sentence broke. He laughed once, a small, helpless sound. "I need to know if he's okay." The call to Detective Hayes was the other number I had held in my hand all night. She answered like a woman who has been waiting for the right thing to be offered on a plate. Calm, efficient, ready. I spoke to her with the same steady voice I used with Carlos. The names, the transfers, the forged signature that James had flagged, the hotel receipt and the account numbers. I told her about the voicemail messages Carlos had left, and the documentation James had gathered. I handed the phone to James's inbox when she asked for it. She told me she would start coordinating with her counterparts in the state where the missing person report originated. She dropped no promises. She did say simply, "You did the right thing." The next 24 hours became a blur of legal forms and careful steps. James forwarded encrypted files to Detective Hayes. The lawyer I'd called, alert, dry, fond of saying chain of custody, the way others say, "How are you?" Filed paperwork and made the formal referrals that move things from suspicion to procedure. A name was added to the list that tasted like old crime novels, Agent Patricia Morrow, FBI. When you hear that name in a kitchen at 2 a.m, it feels like a nudge from a higher, slower world. Agent Morrow called in a voice that was both plain and discreet. She wanted what we had, and she wanted the truth of what I had seen and felt. She asked the kinds of questions that build a case like a house. Who had access to which accounts? Who could have known the hospital code? Who had motive to create a child's life out of paper and then put that life in motion? She listened when I told her about Vanessa's tight courtesy and my son's squinting disbelief. She did not sound reproving. She sounded intent. It was a relief. Investigations, I learned, are sometimes slow because they are exacting. They ask for patience and provide protocol in exchange. Subpoenas, subpoenas, more subpoenas. They offered me protection of a sort, procedural shelter. They also asked for patience, and patience is a currency hard to spend when the thing you fear is at the center of your days. Within a week, the small, separate threads James had been pulling began to knot into something thicker. Bank transfers traced through shell accounts converged on payments to a handful of hotels and to an LLC registered in a state I could not place on a map without looking. The marriage records James had flagged did not simply misname a husband. They layered identities until a person's past looked like a costume closet. The FBI's reach, cold and meticulous, began to pull these threads tight. They came with cold box evidence lists and a quiet authority that made even my own files small and necessary. Vanessa's whereabouts became a patchwork of receipts and a trail of hotel check-ins. She had been on the move, brief stays, cash payments, new phone numbers. The police found evidence of ticket purchases, nothing dramatic, all the things a person in a hurry leaves that are not meant to be left for anyone to read. It was the pattern that mattered. Successive short-term lodgings, payments that lined up suspiciously with transfers from accounts connected to our family. And then one night, a call came in that made my ribs ache with a different kind of cold. Officers had located a room in a small-town motel where a woman matching Vanessa's description had been staying. The child was there. I will not describe the moment of the recovery in anything like surgical detail. There is a way to tell you that something good happened without painting the steps of how officers got inside a door. The officers entered, found a sleeping child, and found a woman who had been living one life and pretending another. They took custody of the child
and conducted their interviews in the hall of the motel and later at the station. They arrested Vanessa on charges that included kidnapping and fraud.
The papers read technical and clean. Taken into custody, processed, charges filed. But the human part of it remained between a woman asleep over a crib and a county badge that chose to name what had occurred. Carlos flew across the country with a gravity in his face I had not seen in my son in years. When he met Jacob, there was a lift in his shoulders that was equal parts relief and astonished tenderness. They performed that awkward, beautiful ritual of strangers who are somehow finally known to each other. Hands awkward in those first moments, a reflection in a hospital window taking in the newness of being a family with an ordeal behind them. I stood at a respectful distance. My chest felt like a theater audience waiting to weep on cue. The boy's face softened when Carlos sang a phrase in Portuguese, small sounds that matched the map of a life he had not yet remembered but somehow recognized. That alone told me that the child belonged in that life. When Vanessa appeared in court for the first time, she was quiet. Her lawyer argued, the state argued. The charges in the indictment were painstakingly listed, a legal litany that stacked up small frauds into a pattern that looked like a business plan for deception. There were bank transfers and shell corporations. There were forged records. There was, most painfully, an allegation that a child had been misrepresented and moved in a way that made a father look for a child he had been told was gone. The courtroom is a sterile place for such messy things. It attempts to remove the ragged edges and call them evidence. The arrest of Vanessa did not end the investigation. It widened it. Agent Morrow had a list of names and a map of accounts that suggested a system, people who specialized in making identities pliable and movable. She used the word network in that stripped-down way law enforcement uses words like network at 4 p.m, heavy with meaning, light on melodrama. The trail led to a man James's notes had flagged months earlier, a figure who seemed to orchestrate arrangements from a distance, who profited from selling false lives and who had a way of recruiting people to play roles. He had a name that sounded respectable, Dr. Harrison Blackwood, and an infrastructure that looked like a consulting firm on paper and something darker in its practice. Blackwood, the agents told me, was not a shadowy villain from a movie. He was a professional who had learned to monetize other people's disguises. They built a case linking him to business entities, to payments funneled in neat lines, to recruitment forums where lonely people and those desperate for belonging were offered roles and told how to play them. The FBI called their evidence methodical: financial forensics, witness accounts, communications that showed patterns of coordination. They did not say more than they needed to. Their strategy was wall by wall, not fireworks. As the case escalated, so did threats. The first note was a thin scrap left tucked under a jazz station flyer at my door. Keep quiet, it read, simple as a grocery list. Then came calls with silence on the other end, a parked car that matched a vehicle reported in the area when Vanessa's car had been seen leaving town. James saw the pattern first and told me to avoid alone walks and to change routes. Detective Hayes increased patrols near my neighborhood. Agent Morrow advised a temporary arrangement that felt both strange and comforting: additional presence, a small doorstop of procedural shelter. They did not say witness protection lightly, but they did say that there were ways to protect those who chose to testify. The network, if that is the right word, did not crumble with one arrest. People who profit from lies understand the economy of silence: threats, bribery, pressure in the form of social ostracism or financial inducement. There were attempts to contact James, to intimidate Carlos, to refuse cooperation. There was an episode where a man connected to one of the shell accounts tried to intercede, asking for leniency in return for information that was either false or useless. The FBI identified attempts to obstruct investigation and to free key figures. In one incident that felt as if it had been pulled from a cheap thriller, a man associated with Blackwood's circle attempted to arrange a legal assistance for a defendant in custody. The attempt failed, but the fact of it made everyone involved, the agents, the detectives, and us, understand the stakes had shifted. When the decision was made that I should testify in person, the option that once sounded like an honor turned into something that tasted of metal in my mouth. The idea of standing in a courtroom and telling a jury what I had seen and what I had done felt simple and monumental at once. Agent Morrow and Detective Hayes spoke to me about safety. They explained what they could do and the limits of what they could promise. They were honest, as they had been from the first day. It gave me confidence that what we were doing was not stunt justice, but slow, heavy work. My son, my David, had his own tempest to navigate. He was not the architect of any of this. He was a man caught between devotion and deception. For a while, he leaned on denial like a man clinging to a railing during a storm. When the evidence became undeniable, when the hotel receipts and the medical registers failed to line up with Vanessa's story, he came apart in a public way. We had days of hard neighborly grief, arguments that were less about blame than about the loss of an image, the image of a life that had kept him warm. He went to Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a therapist whose room smelled faintly of citrus, who taught him until he could stop asking himself the questions that would not let him sleep. Therapy, we learned, is not a speed fix.
It is a steady exercise in peeling back layers until you find what you are built of, and David was determined to be built of something steady. The trial began in a courthouse that smelled of old wood and compressed air, courtroom galleries filled with neighbors and people who followed local headlines. The prosecution presented financial records, James's careful reports, and the voice blocks that suggested repeated contact between orchestrators in different states. They put bank tellers and forensic accountants on the stand. They provided the chain of custody for the documents and the digital records. The defense strategy was sharp and predictable. Create doubt about the provenance of the documents, suggest motive in those who accused, and attempt to isolate the accused from the brigade of people around them who were painting the picture of a crime. When my turn to speak came, I did not rehearse a panoply of dramatic lines. I told the truth, the way I had in my kitchen at midnight, plainly, with attention to the things I had directly observed. I said nothing for which I could not be asked to provide evidence. I told them about the small slights that had added up to suspicion, about the receipts slid under my door, about the voice on a voicemail that had sounded like a father's exhaustion. I spoke of the organizer in my coat and of James's reports. I testified about the phone call I had made to Carlos and the one I had placed to Detective Hayes. I spoke in the language of a woman who had spent much of her life making sure the small things were done right, birthday candles aligned, pies sliced even, and who had now found herself determining how to be right in the larger, more dangerous way. The defense was relentless. They painted me as a woman slighted and bitter, a narrative that has an ancient and unfortunate appeal in courtrooms. They suggested that I had motives beyond protection, attention, a desire to keep my place at a table. I felt the shove of that suggestion like a hand at my back, and I turned, as I had been taught, to the records. James stepped forward and explained, with an examiner's clarity, how he had obtained the documents, how he had verified signatures, how he had traced transfers. Detective Hayes described the investigative steps, what searches had produced what results, what legal instruments had permitted them to see into the accounts where the money had gone. Agent Morrow explained how financial forensics revealed an organization that coordinated identity creation and then sold those identities like packaged services. The defense tried to smear the chain to suggest contamination. The court relied on chain of custody. The jury listened. There was a tense afternoon that lingered in my chest for weeks, the cross-examination. The defense attorney tried to lead me into confessions of gap-toothed memory. He waved a photograph and asked me to recall a tone of voice I had only heard once. He implied motives, as if motives were a flavor you could taste and then name. I did not rise to the bait. I answered the questions with simple honesty. If I did not know something, I said I did not know. There is a surprising kind of dignity in admitting ignorance when the world asks you to be omniscient. The jury did not need me to be perfect. They needed me to be credible. Then the architects of the network began to fall. Blackwood was indicted on charges that included conspiracy and racketeering related to identity fraud and child trafficking in the narrow sense of moving a child to conceal parentage. The indictment was long and technical, but it meant the investigators had connected disparate lines into a body. Other arrests followed, people who had created documents, people who had managed accounts, people who had counseled others on ways to misrepresent genealogies and histories. Some were small-time operators who had been hired for a fee. Others were more deeply embedded in the business of manufacturing lives. In the weeks that followed, there was an ugly human mix of relief and fear. The relief came from the knowledge that crimes were being named and measured. The fear came from the fact that people who profit from lies are often good at persuading others to remain loyal through threats and admiration and money. We learned of attempts to obstruct justice, bribed witnesses, a man who claimed he had been paid to provide an alibi and then could not produce a credible story. There was an attempted escape at a county jail by a person associated with the network, a clumsy plot that failed because it depended on more people than its planners could control. The attempt to free someone under indictment was an escalation, a clear sign that the network was willing to use force when it thought the law might finally catch it.
One night, as the trial moved towards its last stages, I received a message. Someone had offered money in return for silence. The offer was clumsy and transactional. I told Detective Hayes. They logged the attempt as an obstruction. It made the abstract threats feel concrete and immediate. The agents moved to increase protective measures. The court allowed for secure entrances and for me to be escorted by officers. Witness protection was discussed with the usual sterile terms that both comforted and frightened me. Relocation, identity aid, measures meant to hide a life that had once been visible. Agent Morrow asked me if I wanted that. I thought of my son and of the simple things I had never imagined losing. My garden of geraniums, the bench at the church, the neighbor who watered my plants when I was away. For a long time I said no. I thought love required that I stay where I was.
But when the threats escalated and the man LinkedIn papers began to threaten those around them, the decision to accept protection felt less like cowardice and more like duty. My place did not have to be a geographical spot. It needed to be where I could keep telling the truth. The day the jury returned a guilty verdict on the central charges, I remember feeling a heaviness like rain falling on a tent. It did not sweep me up and carry me to some shining shore. It was a relief, yes, but a sober one. The convictions included multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Several of the network's key members were prepared to be sentenced. The jury's work was not the end, but an important hinge. The architect, Dr. Harrison Blackwood, was among those convicted after the prosecution threaded together evidence of how his firm had operated as a clearinghouse for false narratives and documents. The judge read the verdicts with a voice that made the room feel smaller. Then the sentencing hearings began, technical and procedural, with victims given a chance to speak. When the sentences were handed down, they were not theatrical. The judge talked about restitution and about the harm done in ways that legal people try to translate into numbers and orders. He spoke of the child, always with care, and of the families who had been hurt. The men and women who had been jailed would spend years inside, and the scale of their punishment was measured with a court's arithmetic. It felt like justice, not revenge, a binding of things that had been untethered. The craziest thing about justice is that it does not heal like a bandage. It is more like the work of gardeners who clear rubble and then plant. The plants are fragile at first. They need patience. Carlos and Jacob started rebuilding in small ways. They went to the park and let the boy feed ducks. They visited a clinic and established care. It was messy and ordinary. David entered therapy in earnest and began the slow job of looking at where his trust had been placed and how he wanted to love in the future. We had family dinners that were quiet and strained at first, places where silence was more manageable than conversation, and then slowly conversation returned. The apple pie made another appearance at a small birthday. David carved the cake not with theatrics, but with a hand that trembled less each time. There were also moments that felt like a miracle of small things. One evening, I walked with Jacob in a stroller down to the small harbor near our house. The tide smelled like a story of salt and memory. He yawned, reached for a seagull feather, and smiled in a way that made my lungs fill up with air I had forgotten I could breathe normally. Carlos pushed the stroller with a rhythm that looked like it had always known that motion. David came later, sitting on a bench and looking at the water as if it could tell him what to do next.
We laughed at something small, an old man tripping on a phrase, and the sound of that laughter fit in my ears like an answer to a prayer that had nothing supernatural in it, but everything human. I was not untouched by bitterness. I had been publicly humiliated at a Christmas table, and that humiliation left small scars that do not entirely heal. But healing is not the absence of scars. It is the reorientation around them. I learned to see my pearls not as a relic of a past dignity, but as a talisman of the moment I chose to pick them up and leave a room with grace. My choice that night, quiet, measured, decisive, had been the hinge that opened other doors. I never wanted to be the woman who storms an event and uses spectacle as validation. I wanted the law to do its job, and I wanted truth to be the hinge on which our family could swing back toward light. Not everyone wanted to reconcile. Some guests who had attended that Christmas still believed the comfortable story they had been given. There were neighbors who would not look at me in the grocery store. That is the price of insistence for some. You clarify a truth and lose a story. I lost more than one friend who preferred a lie, but I gained more than I had expected. Trust reformed, an honest relationship with my son that had to be rebuilt on soil that was clearer for being tilled, and the chance for Jacob to grow up without being the pivot of someone else's ledger. In the months that followed the trial, life settled into new patterns. David and I cooked together again, not dramatically, not like a TV segment, but the simple work of chopping and tasting. We developed rituals of smallness, a cup of chamomile before bed, a long walk after church on Sunday mornings. Carlos and Jacob started celebrating holidays that made sense to them, with David learning Portuguese phrases so the boy would have the sound of more than one language in his life. James kept in touch. He is a man who knows the business of endings and loose threads, and I sent him a pie every Thanksgiving, because that is how the world should sometimes be repaid. I spoke at a hearing months later, where survivors of similar scams spoke their names into a public record. My words there were short: confirm the facts, call for cooperation between jurisdictions, support families. The experience left me with a keen sense of how vulnerable people are made into commodities by those who prey on trust and on the human hunger for belonging. I found myself speaking to groups about the practicalities, how to notice small inconsistencies, how to ask questions without renouncing love, and always to emphasize that the law is the tool we must use. I never suggested anyone take justice into their own hands. The law is clumsy but necessary. There was a quiet justice, too, in the personhood of those who had been hurt, but who refused to be reduced to their victimhood. Carlos took Jacob to the beach and taught him how to build small fortifications in the sand.
Jacob hammered a plastic shovel at a tower and then collapsed it with a satisfied giggle. The acts of building and collapsing and then rebuilding are the tiniest, most human metaphors for the work we had all done. Break trust where necessary, attend to the children, do the labor of reconstruction. I think often about the network's architect, Dr. Blackwood, and about the strange economy where someone can turn identity into currency. His conviction did not feel victorious in the way movies promise victory. It felt, again, like a relief, with the edges still sharp. I was glad the courts had seen through the illusion of a polished operation that preyed on lonely people and fragile families. I was glad for the victims whose voices were finally acknowledged. But I was not glad in an exultant way. It was a sober satisfaction, harm acknowledged, and in measure, repaired. The hardest moments were those when I had to confront my son's pain, because love does not eliminate hurt. There were evenings when he would look at me and say, "Why didn't I see it?" And I would repeat the same thing, that deceit is clever, and that love can be willfully blind. We memorized a new kind of gratitude, to be glad he had gotten through, to help him learn how to forgive himself for a thing he had not chosen. Dr. Martinez taught us that forgiveness is less a gift you give another than a tool you use to avoid being consumed by what was done to you. David learned to use it to make his life forward. The years that followed were not without difficulty: petty legal disputes over custody, appeals that extended the legal shadow a little longer, a few angry letters, and a few threats that never amounted to more than words. The system is imperfect, and justice is slow. But in time, the punitive judgments, the sentences, and the restitution orders settled into the archives of public record. Families reassembled in ways that mattered. Jacob celebrated his second birthday with cake gone disastrously everywhere, and I thought then of the man who would have manufactured a life for profit, and the child whose laughter made such ideas look ridiculous. If there is a thing I would tell anyone who finds themselves, perhaps like me, standing at a threshold between dignity and spectacle, it is this: dignity does not mean silence. Sometimes it means you leave the table with your head held high so you can use your hands to build a ladder out of the scraps. My decision to walk away the night I was told to leave was not passive. It was planning. It was the first step in a work that required patience, legal pathways, and an unwillingness to be bullied by the performance of the moment. People ask me if I regret making that phone call. They imagine I hung up the receiver and watched the world collapse theatrically. The truth is quieter. I regret that anyone was hurt. I regret that a child became a commodity. I regret that my son suffered betrayal. But I do not regret insisting on truth.
The call set in motion the modest machinery of justice. It gave a father back his son and allowed for the slow work of repair. It cost me peace for a time, and for a while, it cost me being comfortable in my neighborhood. But in the calculus of things, it returned to us the very thing that had been sold: honesty, the right naming of people, the small sanctities of family. Years later, I keep the organizer in a drawer. The thumb drive is not something I touch often, but the memory of it is a tool. I tell younger friends, collect receipts, note strange phone calls, trust your sense when layers of small things begin to form a pattern. And do not be ashamed if you are an elder who sees what younger people ignore. We are sometimes underestimated because we are expected to be placid. Use that underestimation as a resource. If you have the heart to protect someone, use the law as your hand. There were days I feared speaking at the trial would cost me safety. It did not cost my life. It cost me comfort and some old illusions about who provides sanctuary. The price was worth paying for a child to be in the arms of the father who searched for him. We have now reclaimed those small domestic acts: buying ice cream cones, picking out shoes, teaching Jacob how to tie a knot on a small shoelace without fuss. None of that would have happened if fear had ruled me, or if I had mistaken being quiet for being kind. At Christmas the following year, we set a smaller table. The centerpiece was modest, a thrifted silver tray with sprigs of holly and a candle. David set a place for me, and a place for Carlos and Jacob. There was, that year, both thanksgiving and a quiet grief for what had been broken. We sang carols off-key. I wore my pearls because they felt like companions now, not talismans. At one point, Jacob reached across the table and took my hand with the single confidence of a child who has been given back an anchor. He squeezed once, and then returned to his cup of cocoa, and I understood in a way that had been too painful to grasp at the outset. My choice had not been about spectacle or defeat. It had been about making space for truth to exist in a room again. If the story of that Christmas and the months after it has a moral, it is not a tidy one. Love is not always comfortable. Sometimes loving someone means making a choice that hurts them in the short term because it protects them in the long term. Sometimes love requires you to speak the truth when it is the costliest thing you can say. But the truth does a particular kind of work. It unbinds things that have been hidden and allows people to choose what they will be without being manufactured by someone else's ledger. I still bake apple pie. It is a ritual that steadies me. People come to my door sometimes with little troubles: a neighbor who needs a word, a young mother who wants to know how to keep an eye out for something that feels wrong.
I tell them what I can, without scaring them. Note inconsistencies, ask questions, and never confuse being kind with wearing blinders. The law is slow and often imperfect, but it is the right road. We must walk it in as many shoes as it takes. If this story moved you, subscribe and share with someone who needs to know. Speaking the truth matters. Tell us in the comments, have you ever trusted your gut and been proven right?